Polish forces in Great Britain in the Second World War, 1939 to 1945. Poland had been invaded by the Germans from the west and the north, from Slovakia in the south, and from Russia a few days, 2 weeks later, from the east. The Poles then fought valiantly for almost a month. Many of those forces had to leave the country to take up the war later from overseas, initially from France and then from Britain. So the Poles provided significant contributions to the Allied effort during the war, fighting on land, on sea, and in the air. And there were, in fact, it's well known, well documented, the amazing achievements by 145 Polish pilots who flew British planes in the Royal Air Force within Polish squadrons, but also in other mixed British squadrons. And so there were 32 wholly Polish 303 airmen, for example, 303 squadron, a similar number of pilots from the Polish Air Force in 302 squadron, many more who were flying and fighting in other RAF squadrons, and later on more squadrons were established to carry on the fight against the evil Nazi German regime. Right, now the other instances of war service was flying French planes, for example. Before they arrived in Britain, they managed to escape first to France, which was another ally of Poland, and France was in direct conflict, direct threat from the Germans with a common border. And so several hundred, possibly a few thousand Polish pilots and soldiers also were in France, ready to fight against both the German Luftwaffe and against the German army on the ground. So we know that some of those pilots flew quite a lot of missions in France. Many were not able to because they didn't have enough aircraft available for them. The soldiers, Polish soldiers, were able to fight alongside the French when the Germans attacked France in what they call the Battle of France, which preceded the Battle of Britain. When France waged war against the invading Germans, there were many Polish personnel. Many died in that fighting. There were about 6,000 Polish soldiers who died in the Battle of France. There were some who managed to escape from France and got to Switzerland. Others managed to escape and get boats to England. But there were about 19,000 Polish were evacuated from France, escaped from the Channel ports, possibly some through Dunkirk, but there were several other missions of Royal Navy ships picking up service people, soldiers, airmen and sailors from France, throughout France, northern France, the west coast on the Bay of Biscay and so on. So about 19,000 Poles were evacuated from France. About a quarter of those 19,000 were airmen or air crew, staff who would maintain service and dispatch the aircraft and so on. Now, the troops and airmen were transported from Western France to the United Kingdom on ships, boats, yachts, all sorts of vessels, making their way to the safe country of Great Britain. Now, during this time, there were well, the Polish armed forces that escaped to Great Britain managed to fight within the British forces, Army, Navy, and Air Force, under British command. And those numbers of Poles reached 195,000 in 1944. So you had a force of 195,000. But taking all the others, the ones who were no longer fighting, perhaps injured, perhaps killed or whatever, there were 250,000 Poles who fought against the Germans, helping the British and so on. There were even more who helped fight against the Germans in the East, who were controlled by the Soviets. Okay, now some of the people that added to the Polish forces were not just those who escaped Poland and also escaped France. There were others who were able to escape from the Russians or were released by the Russians, who'd been held in prison camps. One often talks about General Anders. He came with enormous numbers who he had convinced the Russians to allow them to be freed to fight against the Germans. And there were many more who had been prisoners of war. So whether Polish forces were imprisoned by the Germans or by the Russians, there were others who even had been forced to fight for the Germans, who, when they were captured by the British, immediately started joining the Polish regiments and Polish squadrons. So we're talking about numbers. Numbers are incredible. There were a tremendous number who came in different times. People, for example, who managed to escape or desert from the German army, 90,000 there were. These are people, Polish people in parts of Poland that the Germans had seized and considered those people to be their forces. They were forced to join the German army, German Air Force and German Navy against their will because they were loyal Poles. But being by then deserters or prisoners of war with us, we quickly realized that these were part of the forces that were needed to fight against the Germans. There were also evacuees that the Russians had kept imprisoned, and something like 83,000 were released by the Soviet Union, and they managed to get to Europe. Yet more Polish forces released by the Russians and the Soviets who fought over in the east from Russia onwards. There were also 35,000 people who evacuated from France. Now that included soldiers and airmen who had got to France. There were also Poles who were expatriates who were living in France. Some of those had escaped Russia and Poland, being Jewish, and others were people working in Western Europe. Then there were prisoners of war that were liberated. So as we all marched east to defeat the Germans, we came across prisoner of war camps, and yet more and more Poles were released and joined the forces for the remaining year or two of the war. And then, of course, there were others who escaped from occupied Europe. So we're talking about probably 200 and odd thousand people. 200, in fact, at least 255,000 people. Okay, there were even Poles who came from America, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, and several other countries. And these were expatriates who were perhaps emigres who had gone there a generation or two earlier, and they got themselves to Britain and fought against the Germans. And we had a few thousand Poles who were expatriates in the United Kingdom as well. Okay. Then, of course, now you think about it, 250,000 service people, men and women, pilots, sailors, soldiers, you know, engineers, whatever, who were going to fight against an evil enemy that had defeated their country and annexed their country. Right. Now, the after Germany was waged war in Poland and defeated the Poles in 1939, the Polish government escaped, fled to England and set up their own Polish government in exile, based in London. They also had similar operation in France, and they formed an army of about 75,000 men. So there were numerous campaigns which the Poles waged war in, both for the French and the British, brigades throughout England and Scotland, battles in Norway, grenadiers, infantry, engineers, and so on, artillery, and anti-aircraft, and so on. Right. There were also soldiers, Polish soldiers, operating out of Egypt and out of Syria, and the Middle East and Far East, and so on. Okay. Now, by the fall of France, some 6,000 Polish personnel had died in the fighting, and about 13,000 had been interned after they escaped into Switzerland. 19,000 Poles, who were about 25% of whom were aircrew, were evacuated from France. They came alongside Polish soldiers, came into the UK, went to various camps where they were able to be housed and trained, most importantly, trained and prepared, provided with uniforms and weapons, and training on how to operate weapon systems. So in fact, later on during the war, General Anders, who was a prisoner in the Soviet Union, he was able to convince the Russians that they should let them go, and they came and they formed the Polish Second Corps from the UK, and a lot of their fighting was done in the Middle East, North Africa, Italy, and so on, where they performed wonderfully in every single theatre of war that they were engaged in. Now, the Air Force, we often talk about the Polish Air Force in the UK, and there have been some incredible films, two very recent films, both produced independently at about the same time. One was called Hurricane, produced in the UK, which is about 303 Squadron. And the other one is called 303 Squadron. That was the one produced in Poland. They're both excellent films. Both deal with the efforts by their Polish airmen and their forces to support the Air Force. You know, the bombardiers, the engineers, the people who would fix and repair and maintain the airplanes and refuel them, rearm them, and get them ready for the pilots to fly out again. It's a constant process of turnarounds. Anyway, the Polish forces were outnumbered in Poland, and they were outmatched by the type of aircraft. The aircraft that the Germans had were a bit more modern, a bit faster, perhaps a few more weapon systems and so on. But nevertheless, the Poles did extremely well in Poland during that month of warfare against the Germans and the Poles, against the Germans and the Russians. The Polish Air Force destroyed 285 Luftwaffe aircraft, and they damaged 279 more. And during the whole campaign, the Poles lost 333. So that's probably better than the Germans. The Germans had, in effect, lost something like 550 aircraft against the Polish 333. Right. So now the Polish pilots were famous for fighting in the Battle of Britain. And of course, when they arrived, when they were ready to start flying, was right in the middle of the Battle of Britain. So the British government and the Polish government in exile established 4 squadrons. 300 and 301 squadron were Polish bomber squadrons, and 302 and 303 fighter squadrons. Now, those operated from the very day that they started in, I think it was August. Yeah, went into action, I think, in August of 1940, part way through the Battle of Britain. Now, from the very beginning, or shortly after the beginning, the Royal Air Force welcomed foreign pilots to supplement a dwindling pool of British pilots. There probably weren't enough qualified pilots or experienced pilots. Of course, some of them were being killed or injured. And we desperately needed skilled pilots to fly the fighter aircraft and the bombers to wage war and prevent an invasion of Britain. So anyway, there were 3. Now, during that time, the 303 squadron fought and claimed 303. Sorry, not 303. 296 German aircraft shot down, and many more were damaged as well. They had also done extremely well in France. One of the squadrons in France was the 145 squadron, GC, which operated French aircraft flown by Polish pilots. And although the numbers of aircraft were not really enough to provide one for each Polish pilot, the Poles still managed to score 60 victories against in the destruction of German aircraft, and many more were damaged. They only lost 8 men in combat. 8 pilots were lost in combat. So the Poles, in very, very small numbers, achieved 7.9% of all French victories in that short period in the Battle of France. And anyway, from the beginning, the Royal Air Force, as I said, welcomed foreign pilots, and some of these came from the Commonwealth, for example, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on. You know, even people who were expatriates living abroad in America, in South America, in the Middle East, and so on. They quickly got themselves back to Britain. Now, there was a little bit of doubt initially whether it was possible to provide aircraft and squadrons for the Polish pilots, but it was very quickly decided that they must be equipped to fight against the Germans. And so they welcomed these foreign pilots to supplement the British pilots. The Polish government in exile signed an agreement with the British government to form both a Polish army and a Polish air force. And they already at that time had the Polish Navy, who were operating Polish ships around the waters of the United Kingdom and across the Atlantic. Right. Now, the first 2 Polish squadrons went into action in August 1940. Later on, there were probably another 10 or so. They got into action immediately. There were probably another 89, I think, or 90 Polish fighter pilots in the British squadrons, and so on. So, sorry, no, there were 89 Polish fighter pilots, and another 50 were in other British squadrons. But as time went by, all these numbers increased dramatically as people managed to get themselves to the United Kingdom and immediately sign up to join their colleagues, their comrades. Now, the Polish pilots were amongst the most experienced in the Battle of Britain in the Royal Air Force, because most of them had already fought in the 1939 invasion of Poland. They also fought in the 1940 Battle of Britain. And in addition to all of that, they'd always had a very high level, a very high standard of pilot training. So when they arrived, they were well prepared for the job in hand. Now, the 303 Squadron was called the Warsaw Squadron, but they also named it the Kosciuszko, after a Polish general who had helped America in the fight against the English in the 1700s. The 302 Squadron was called the Poznan Squadron. 302 Squadron Poznański flew from mainly, from various airports, but initially during the Battle of Britain from Duxford near Cambridge, quite close to Essex, whereas 303 Squadron flew from RAF Northolt, which is on the west of London. Okay, so 303 Squadron claimed 126 kills and a very large number of damaged aircraft. This was the highest number of victories for all RAF fighter squadrons engaged in the Battle of Britain. And that's even though the Poles only joined the combat late on the 30th of August. So the Polish pilots only represented 5% of all the pilots flying in the Battle of Britain, but they were responsible for 12% of all the victories. They were more than double as effective as the remaining pilots in the rest of the Royal Air Force. So they certainly made a very substantial contribution, and they certainly harmed the German Luftwaffe very, very much. Right. As time went on, the Polish Air Force fought elsewhere, not just from the UK or defending us against bombers attacking the UK. They also fought in foreign campaigns, including in Tunisia and elsewhere in North Africa. And the famous Polish fighting team, which was 145 Squadron, often called Skalski's Circus. The Poles also were involved in raids on Germany, both as bombers, but as time went by and the aircraft got greater range, the fighter pilots would accompany the bombers on their flights over Germany to protect the bombers from the Luftwaffe. And of course, every other part of the Second World War in the European theatre. So that's over Germany, in Yugoslavia, Italy, Greece, every part of the operation that was going on. Now, there were 8 Polish fighter squadrons formed within the RAF, and a similar number of bomber squadrons, but also reconnaissance, maritime, and also supporting artillery and so on, and night fighter squadrons, search and rescue, and so on. So by the May 1945, the end of the war, the Poles had destroyed 629 German Luftwaffe aircraft. And also by the end of the war, about 19,000 Poles were serving in the RAF. Now, there were very, very many Polish squadrons. I mentioned earlier 300 Bomber Squadron, 301 Bomber Squadron, Masovia and Pomerania, they are, 302 Poznan, 303 Warsaw, 304 Silesia, 305 Greater Poland, 306 Torun, 307 Lvov, 308 Krakow, 309 Czerwien, and so on. So they operated. Yeah, there we are. Czerwien. Oh yeah, 315 City of Deblin, 316 Warsaw. That was a later Warsaw. because initially 303 was called City of Warsaw, but later 316 was called City of Warsaw. 317 City of Wilno, 318 City of Gdansk, 663 Polish Artillery Observation Squadron, 145 Squadron in North Africa, the Skalski Circus. There was also 138 Special Duties Squadron, Polish Flight, 1586 Polish Special Duties Flight, which was carrying spies and weapon systems for resistance operations. Okay, now there were actually a few more. I haven't got those on the list yet, but they are there. So if you count all of the aircraft, there were about 900 German aircraft destroyed. There are nearly 200 more which are probable. Now, probables were aircraft which a pilot would claim as having been shot down, but there was no proof or evidence of it found. They didn't find a wreckage or an escape, a German pilot who parachuted out or whatever. So those were listed as possibles or probables. In addition, damaged aircraft, there were nearly 260 aircraft. So that's something like 1,500 aircraft from the German Luftwaffe that were basically taken out of service. We should also mention the Polish Navy. Just on the eve of war, about 3 or 4 days before, perhaps a few of the ships even earlier, because I believe the Poles already were aware that the Germans were likely to attack or invade because they had access to the coded radio system using I've forgotten the name of it now, but anyway. Representing the Polish Navy ships left Polish waters, except for a tiny handful that were stuck being repaired or overhauled or whatever, who couldn't escape. But the vast majority did manage to escape out through the Baltic and out into the North Sea and even into the Channel of the Atlantic to make contact with the Royal Navy. So they then operated alongside the Royal Navy under the command of the Royal Navy. The Poles fought with the British and later on, obviously, with the Americans and others. The Polish Navy comprised of 2 cruisers, large number of smaller ships. But the Poles were also given a number of ships by the British Royal Navy. These were ships which weren't being used, or they didn't have enough crews for them. They needed modifying or updating, but they would certainly serve well under the command of the Polish Navy. So, and frequently there weren't enough British crews to sail those ships. So the Polish Navy fought with great distinction alongside other Allied navies, the Royal Navy, US Navy, and so on, in many important operations. These included, for example, the attacks on the German battleship Bismarck. That was attacked, that was shelled by one of the Polish Navy ships, badly damaged by it as well. So during the war, the Polish Navy included a total of 27 ships, which is a very large number. 2 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 5 submarines, 11 torpedo boats. And during the war, they sailed over 1.25 million nautical miles of operations. They escorted 787 convoys. They carried out 1,162 patrols and combat operations. They sank 12 enemy ships, which included 5 submarines. They sunk 41 German merchant vessels, and they damaged 24 more. They damaged another 8 German submarines. They shot down 20 aircraft. Regrettably, during the Second World War, 450 Polish seamen died while serving with the Polish Navy in the Royal Navy. But their work was truly amazing. They did such a good job. Just to keep you informed, hundreds of thousands of former Polish citizens, particularly residents of parts of Poland that were annexed and invaded by Nazi Germany, were forced by the Germans to conscript into the German armed forces. So that would have been their German Navy, Air Force, and Army, and so on, Wehrmacht. On the Western Front, German military personnel who were Polish ethnicity and held prisoner of war became a substantial source of manpower for the Polish armed forces in Western Europe. There were nearly 90,000 former German military personnel who were actually Polish, were eventually recruited into the Polish armed forces in the West. And then by Victory Day on the 9th of May 1945, there were a third of Polish service members in the West had actually been forced to fight reluctantly for the Germans. Okay, I think that's about it, really. That's the story so far. I will add more to it later. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.